Hi there. In this series of videos, we're going to take a look at Docker and containers and what the hell they are, or at least a bit of an intro to them anyway. But at the same time, as an example, we're also going to be using Azure to actually basically use that as a repository for the Docker images that we'll get to shortly. Essentially, where you can actually give your Docker entities a home, if you like, in the cloud, but also how you can use Docker on just your desktop on a Windows or Mac. And in addition to that, what we're also going to use is, as an example, I've got a NodeJS web API, just a very basic one, handling some create, update, delete sort of operations with MongoDB, and we're also going to be looking at MongoDB that's hosted in the cloud, something called MongoDB Atlas. Most of this stuff is free. Some resources on Azure you will probably have to pay for, but it'll be minimal sort of stuff anyway. So for this example. Let's just a quick recap on that. So Docker is, there's lots of explanations out on the web if you want proper depth of an explanation, but ultimately what virtual machines have done for computing over the last few years, in other words, having a physical server that can run multiple virtual machines. Well, Docker is sort of virtual applications on top of that. So you can imagine if you've got a server, whether it's a real server or a virtual server, essentially you can run multiple containers. So it's a level down, if you like, or a level up, whichever way you look at it. And the reason for it is that in a lot of cases, when you deploy an application, sure, you can have source control, something like Git, and you can do testing, and you can have builds that will build directly to a specific server. That's fine, And again, Docker won't be for everyone or everything, that is for sure. But what Docker lets you do is if you've got essentially a container, as they call it, that container is your application, but it's also all the bits that go with that. So a lot of the cases where it came from is when people say, well, it worked on my desktop, I deployed it, then it broke because I didn't have this or I didn't have that and something else was missing. Oh, I forgot about that file or whatever it might be. So Docker literally, the general idea is that if it works on your desktop and it builds correctly and compiles correctly, essentially, it should run virtually anywhere where Docker's supported. So, and at the moment, Docker containers are, well, they're everywhere. They're on Amazon Web Services, they're on Azure, they're on Google Cloud, they're on heaps of other providers that are out there. As I say, I'm using Microsoft Azure because that's something I've been used to, but the concept is whether you've got something like a .NET application or a .NET Core application or whatever it might be, in Node.js, Ruby on Rails, whatever it might be, the point being is that can live in a container, and those containers can also work with each other as well. So you can have a container for whatever example, SQL, Microsoft SQL. You can have then a Docker container that's got a .NET application that can communicate through to that other Docker container, or you can have it all in one container depending on the size or what your application's doing. So it's we're going to have some examples anyway, but as I say, it's worth having a look at Docker anyway. So if you go to docker.com, you can certainly look at why Docker. You can download the desktop. So what you generally start with is the Docker desktop, whether it's Mac or Windows, and you'll end up with a little icon here, and it runs basically a small little machine of its own, actually, that is used to build and do things. But ultimately, you've got a Docker environment locally, which is what you'll do when you download this Docker for Windows. as I say, we've got Microsoft Azure, so I've got a subscription here with a few things that I've set up to run through. Again, you don't have to use Azure for containers, absolutely not. You can use Amazon, Google, lots of others out there. There's some really interesting providers, hosting platforms out there as well, like Zeit now and a few others that make it very easy to deploy containers. And again, the cool thing is rather than deploy just an application that you may miss certain things or lose the environment that you've got locally, the container will always have what you've got when you're building it and developing it locally. So that's the key benefit here, is that you're not worrying about, have I deployed the right paths, or have I deployed the right config files, or whatever it might be. And as you'll see, you've got various images versioning as well. There's all sorts of good stuff that goes into it. And as I say, I'm also using something called MongoDB, which is a document-based, you may already know this, but it's a document-based database. So essentially it uses sort of a JSON structure, basically. Again, I'll go into a little bit of this, but it could have been SQL Server, it could have been Progress, it could have been whatever you want, but I just picked this because it was just an example to work with. The other part of this example, which is essentially a Node.js application. So this is where you've got obviously JavaScript in the back end. If you don't know Node.js, go and have a look at nodejs.org. You should be able to download all the necessary parts there. So in the next video, we'll start to go through some of this and how we can actually essentially create a Docker container from what they call Docker images, which are like templates essentially, and we'll have a look at actually running an application locally, but then essentially deploying that container up into Azure.